Good afternoon. Permanent and observer representatives of the OAS, Assistant Secretary General Nestor Mendez, distinguished panelists, representatives of ministries of government, regional and international organizations, civil society, invited guests from across the Americas. Dear OAS colleagues, friends all, good afternoon. I welcome you to today's event, which will shortly be formally opened by Assistant Secretary General Nestor Mendez. As we prepare for the run of today's program, I am pleased to inform that we will be benefiting from bi-directional interpretation in English and Spanish. Kindly use the tools available on the platform to stay abreast of the conversation. Your comments on the platform will be shared with panelists after today's event. Saludando a nuestra audiencia hispanoparlante, igualmente les informo que esta charla se presenta con interpretación bidireccional inglés-español. Mucho les agradeceríamos utilizar las herramientas de la plataforma para mantenerse al tanto de la conversación en el idioma preferido. Asimismo, les informo que estaríamos transmitiendo sus comentarios a los y la panelista después de la charla de hoy. Thank you, gracias. SG, I am pleased to invite you to present opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Henry Martin, and it's great to see everyone once again. Distinguished panelists, Dr. Rosemary Bell Antoine, it's great to have you with us today, Dr. John Herlin Anton, and Dr. Gary Denny. Permanent and observer representatives of the OAS, representatives of the Ministries of Education who are connected, regional and international organizations, invited guests from across the Americas, OAS colleagues and friends. Welcome to a special edition of A Chat with the OAS. Buenas tardes a todas y todos. Un gran placer saludarles. Today's activity is held in the waning moments of the 6th Inter-American Week for People of African Descent in the Americas, commemorated this year from March 20th to the 24th under the theme Fighting Slavery's Legacy of Racism through Transformative Education in the Americas. El impacto de la pandemia del COVID-19 sobre nuestras funciones cotidianas no solo ha dejado una marca indeleble en nuestra organización, sino que se refleja en todo nuestro hemisferio y en el mundo. Es innegable que la pandemia provocó un cambio importante en los procesos de pensamiento y las perspectivas tradicionales, trastocando las nociones arraigadas y generando nuevas perspectivas sobre los elementos fundamentales de nuestras sociedades. Uno de estos replanteamientos concierne a la educación y al entorno tradicional de aprendizaje. At the OAS, we are committed to ensuring that our work aligns with the shifting needs of our peoples in the Americas. Through our many program offerings, including scholarships, internships, and the Model OAS, we provide opportunities in education to reach a broad population inclusive of the underserved and marginalized, particularly those of the Afro descent community, to foster an indomitable sense of pride in cultural identity and civic engagement. We fully recognize that education must encompass more than the transfer of knowledge in the classroom. Transformative education must foster critical thinking skills, encourage careful analysis of information, and nurture the development of skills necessary to navigate complex issues and to make informed decisions. Transformative education must help students understand their own values, biases, strengths, and weaknesses, and prioritize social justice. It should also encourage them to take action to address inequities and to promote equality and fairness. Transformative education must validate one's sense of self and position our people to assess and to make redress so that we are increasingly confident about our own capacity to innovate, to find creative solutions to our problems, to be unabashed in the use of new technologies, and to pursue lifelong learning. Señoras y señores, no olvidemos dónde empieza la educación. Las semillas que se siembran en las mentes de las niñas y niños germinarán y florecerán en los adultos de mañana. También citando un proverbio africano que dice, el conocimiento es como un jardín. Si no se cultiva, no se puede cosechar. Por lo tanto, tenemos la responsabilidad colectiva de cultivar esas mentes con los principios de igualdad, equidad y respeto hacia todos los seres humanos. Our illustrious panelists are steeped in the knowledge and the experience of educating for tomorrow, as well as in elements related to the impact of education on Afro-descendant populations. Their perspectives will be a light that can inform our thoughts on the topic and certainly inspire a keen appreciation of their insights and bold recommendations for cementing pride in our Afro-descendant student populations. It is my great honor to share these remarks with you in the hope that, combined with their reflections, our words will together edify and inspire you to become a catalyst for transformational learning and impactful change within our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ASG Mendez. We're pleased to present for your edutainment the rendition of I'm an African, originally sung by Alston Beckett Cyrus of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, known in Calypso and soca circles as Beckett. Today's version is delivered by Candela Williams Johnson, accompanied by Lofton Sargent of the Image Band, as presented during the launch of this 6th Inter-American Week for People of African Descent in the Americas here at OS headquarters. I am an African.
Growing up in the Caribbean, I was taught about colonism. Growing up in the Caribbean, I was taught about colonism. But when I check out my history and I check out my ancestry, I have to face reality. I could boast and brag, I could wave my flag, but I know who I am. I am an African. I'm proud of the motherland. Don't doubt me. I'm proud of my ancestry. Do a little dance. Oh, how they try to ignore my mother country. Oh, how they try to brainwash me. Ignore my mother country. But when I remember the triangle, how they bought and sold my people, tell myself that's impossible. When I remember the great trips, them wicked ships, I remember all the injustice. I am an African. I'm proud of the motherland. Don't doubt me. I'm proud of the ancestry. I am an African. I'm proud of the motherland. Don't doubt me. I'm proud of my ancestry. Yeah. I am African. Don't doubt me. I'm from the Caribbean.
Yeah.
No money could get me to betray my ancestry. Don't try me. I am an African. Let me hear you.
All right. Hear me. Jamaicans.
Hey, African. Sing it.
Trinbagonians. African. Barbadians.
Sing it.
African.
Join me.
Antiguans. African. Barbadians.
Hey, African.
Kittitians.
African.
Nigerians.
African.
Vincentians.
African.
Grenadians.
African.
Dominicans.
African.
St. Lucians.
African.
Virgin Islanders.
African.
Anguillians.
African.
Guyanese.
African.
Haitians.
African.
Cubans.
African.
Bahamians.
African.
Bermudians.
African.
All
Thank
right.
you. Thank you so much.
Africa. Africa.
Thanks again to Saj and the image band of the DMV here in Washington, DC. It is my absolute honor to introduce today's experts who will present on the theme, Decolonizing Education in the Americas, mainstreaming policies and practices that engender pride in African heritage and identity. After their profiles are read, we will hear consecutively from panelists who will address the topic in the order in which they were introduced for 10 minutes each. We anticipate very interesting takes on this timely conversation and stand ready to be enthralled. Dr. Gary Denny. Dr. Gary Denny is an associate professor of history at St. Mary's College of Maryland. He obtained his bachelor's at the University of the West Indies at Cave Hill and his doctorate at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Denny has lectured at Mona University of the West Indies and at Kenya College in South Africa. His experience and expertise were essential in assisting with the creation of the program in Africa and African diaspora studies at St. Mary's College. He's also taught courses in African history, Caribbean history, and American slave systems. He's currently writing a multi-volume history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, of which Volume 1, scheduled to be published this year, is entitled Native Genocide and African Enslavement in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. He has written and lectured extensively on the politics of death in modern South Africa and of his role as a speech writer for Nelson Mandela. Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine is the principal of the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies, pro-vice chancellor and chair professor of labor law and offshore financial law, and Oxford and Cambridge scholar. She holds a doctorate in law from Oxford, Master of Laws from Cambridge, Bachelor of Laws from the University of the West Indies, and certificates in international human rights from the International Institute of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Dr. Antoine is an attorney, award-winning scholar and author, international consultant, temporary Court of Appeal judge, and activist. She was elected president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the only person to date from Trinidad and Tobago to have served in this capacity, and was also the rapporteur for persons of African descent and discrimination, rapporteur for indigenous peoples, and head of the OAS Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Unit. Dr. Antoine remains committed to the development within the framework of human rights. She enjoys painting, gardening, and she is a trained classical singer. Dr. John Anton Sánchez, doctor en Ciencias Sociales por la Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales, Ecuador. Es profesor investigador titular del Instituto de Altos Estudios Nacionales en Ecuador. Miembro de la Comisión Gestora de la Universidad de las Nacionales e Indígenas Amuatay Huasi. Sus líneas de investigación son diáspora africana en las Américas, raza, racismo, etnicidad y desigualdades, indicadores sociales de desigualdad y discriminación, movimientos sociales afrodescendientes, temas de antropología afrodescendiente y teoría de los derechos de los pueblos y nacionalidades. John Anton es parte del Instituto Afrodescendiente para la Investigación, los Estudios y el Desarrollo y socio de Alianza Afro-Latinoamericana para el Decenio Internacional Afrodescendiente. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to present our first panelist. He will be followed directly by panelists 2 and 3. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Dr. Gare Denny.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone. This is a pleasure to be speaking to you. And it's I suppose good fortune that I'm from St. Vincent, and the song by Beckett was sung, and I have been singing that song, I suppose, for a million years now, since I think, if my memory serves well, Beckett first produced that song probably around 1977, maybe 7. Peter Tosh sang, No Matter Where You're From, You're an African in 1977, and Beckett is after that, so Beckett is probably in the early 80s. And so I'm very glad to hear the Beckett song. Also, I actually played that song earlier this year because I'm teaching a class on Africa and the African diaspora, and I taught the song. It lays out a critical platform from which the students can begin to understand that when we speak of Africa and the African diaspora, especially if you're living in the United States, it is not simply an American phenomena, but it's hemispheric and ultimately global, Africa and the African diaspora. Indeed, one of my trick questions that I ask these students is, which country in the world, has the largest number of Black people, besides, second only to Nigeria? And the answer is Brazil. And generally, no student, knows that answer, as I feel quite proud about that, and so on. But as I said, I'm a Vincentian, and having played Beckett's song is a kind of fortuitous moment, because I want to speak about St. Vincent, okay? And I want to speak about, and as noted in the introduction, I am currently engaged with some, fellow authors in working on Native genocide and African enslavement in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And what I was thinking about as I looked at the topic would suggest, just merely suggest that the end goal is pride, and so on. Though I suppose I would recommend, that the end goal, of the kind of research and teaching of Africa is knowledge. Okay, knowledge might generate pride, but knowledge obviously can do so much more, and the challenge that I suppose I want to present here is that in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for quite a long time, there was a hidden knowledge. It's the erasure of historical knowledge is what I want to speak about, and why it is so important to engage in this kind of work. A couple miles off St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Vincent is a very small island. For those of you who do not know, we are at our largest, maybe 15 miles long and 12 miles wide. It's 150 square miles, including all of the Grenadine Islands. And we have a population of about 100,000+ people or thereabout. So you know, even within the context of the Caribbean, given we have Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados, and so on, we are pretty small, okay, and so on. So let that be known. Yet off of St. Vincent, these smaller islands, there's one called Baliso. And I have been thinking and writing about Baliso over the last year or so. And Baliso is a very special place, which for most of my adult life, I knew nothing about. Because buried on Baliso is about 2,000 men, women, and children of African descent and South American descent. The British would call them the Black Caribs. They would call themselves the Garifuna. And they died in 1797 on Baliso when the British shipped just over 4,000 of these indigenous residents of St. Vincent, exiled them from St. Vincent onto Baliso, without food, without water. The place it's essentially barren. It is simply inimical to human life. We're not supposed to live there. We need food and water. And so, of course, what we have is mass murder. Half the population died in less than a year before those who survived were then sent on to Belize and Honduras and other places where the population would regenerate itself and so on. So Baliso is a monument of mass murder. But here's the problem. The vast majority of Vincentians knew nothing about this. It's not taught in our schools. In fact, you know, I'm a graduate of the University of the West Indies. I did, you know, my first degree at K-Ville, and at K-Ville, and I taught at Mona for 1 year. And so I'm pretty much familiar with how we go about doing history in the Caribbean. No one knew the story for a very, very long time. And so part of the purpose of engaging in the kind of research and the creation and distribution of knowledge is the reclamation of history, to reclaim that which we had lost. You know, Beckers wrote this wonderful book on Britain's Black Death and so on. But even the great Hilary Beckers has very little to say about the circumstances of the genocide that the British committed at Baliso and the processes through which this was erased from the historical memory of the vast majority of Vincentians. So, fortunately, the Garifuna, these so-called Black Caribs in the British language, who were exiled to Belize and Honduras and so on, they didn't forget. Neither did their children forget, nor their grandchildren. And so what they did, they created a new cosmology, a new sense of place, a new sense of value, transforming St. Vincent into ancestral land, transforming Baliso into sacred space. Now, all this is happening over the course of the next 200 years. In Belize, in Honduras, in Nicaragua, and so on. But within the Caribbean itself, in St. Vincent, in Dominica, in Grenada, in Trinidad, we don't know. Okay. And so it is not until the 1960s with the Black Power movement, which was in and of itself a kind of confrontation with colonial education, do we begin to have the first whispers of a new kind of intellectual tradition within which we could approach the Vincentian past without genuflecting to the colonizers, without genuflecting to the slave masters, writing a historiography that accepts the humanity of these indigenous peoples who had been exiled from St. Vincent. Bear in mind that for the British, okay, these indigenous peoples whom they call the Black Caribs, but who I must insist, they call themselves the Garifuna, and so that's the name that we accept. These indigenous peoples, they were presented as cannibals, as uncivilized, as without any kind of, I suppose, moral equality between themselves and the British. But it is the British who committed mass murder. And so, for me, the work that we are doing in St. Vincent, it's not simply the reclamation of knowledge, but beyond that, it's about rejuvenating a sense of humanity among Vincentians who are unaware that there's a site, unlike any other throughout the Caribbean, where we can actually go and recognize, here stands a monument to British injustice. Here stands a monument to mass murder. This process really began when the Garifuna would return to St. Vincent in the late 1990s. And so now what we have is a pilgrimage every year from the mainland to Baliso. And so there you have an immediate engagement with that historic moment. And so there's shared mourning between the Garifuna and local Vincentians, as local Vincentians are increasingly becoming more deeply aware of the historic nature of what took place in 1797. Okay. And so when we think about the decolonizing education, okay, what does it mean? It seems to me that the story of the Garifuna and the reclamation of Baliso as a sacred space, as a monument to mass murder, that this is an end product. Okay. So it's not simply that we are seeking to be proud of our African heritage, but beyond that, we are seeking knowledge in and of itself, because in reclaiming this knowledge, we have a greater capacity to position ourselves in the world, to see ourselves as historical figures, to recognize how we can transform our present, because we have this fuller understanding of the past. And so I would recommend to each and every one that you take a look at the Garifuna history and remember that in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there's a place called Baliso, which is a monument to mass murder, and which the Garifuna has transformed into a sacred space. I made that pilgrimage for the first time about 1 week ago or so, and I can vow to you that I will recommend that each and every Vincentian makes that pilgrimage, because in doing so, we enter that kind of transformation of knowledge, transformation of values, which our first speaker did say is the purpose. How do we transform our world? In St. Vincent, we can begin so, and through the broader Caribbean, by recognizing that there's a monument to mass murder standing right in our midst. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denny. I'm pleased to present Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine.
Good afternoon to our Secretary General and Chair ESG Nestor Mendez, this very distinguished group. And I will be speaking from the perspective of the Commonwealth Caribbean, although no doubt there are some general experiences. And I want to suggest that there are still both external and internal pressures to our education system, which leads us to persistent poverty, that concept that George Beckford, one of our preeminent economists, spoke of when he described the modern day plantation economy and paradigm, which is a legacy from colonialism, always working to serve the outside, the developed countries, to develop outside of ourselves and deriving very little benefit from our own efforts. So for example, we continue to export raw products like cocoa, coffee, and so on, have it repackaged and refined and sold back to us at exorbitant prices. So we need to be more conscious of these elements that hinder us, and forward going, we need to indeed, I agree with the main thesis, mainstream, proactive, sensitive, and specific strategies to address them. And it is only then that we can engender pride and overcome the negative legacies of slavery and colonialism. And the education system is a key tool for transformation. It's vital in this endeavor. But I do believe that in some ways we have gone backward. There was a period in the 1970s, and Dr. Denny spoke to it, when there was real education happening. There was a new philosophy being formed. There was advocacy, that's Black Power movement. It did result in some concrete changes, particularly in industry and employment. For example, before, if you were dark skinned, you couldn't work in a bank and so on. And certainly there was a sense of consciousness, but much of that has eroded. But ironically, we are seeing that this diminution in self-worth as Afro-descendant peoples is coming precisely at a time when there's huge pride in things like African dress, African names, even African hairstyles. Those things are on the increase. We also seeing some new partnerships with African singers, persons from Africa. And those are all good, they're great. But I would submit that they have not been accompanied by concrete strategic initiatives in the education and research sector. And notice I add research to education. The schools and universities, which have the potential to reach more directly and incisively into the power dynamics that we inherited from slavery and colonialism, and economic control paradigms that still exist today, that of course those negative legacies. So there's a lack of real transformative strategies. And even in terms of the fashion and the culture and so which we have embraced, I think they remain on the periphery. They are more superficial social changes. I don't believe that today they are treated as serious cultural goods that can transform society by the education and research. Artists are left generally to fend for themselves. So industry and real money is still controlled by a small minority, usually white or high brown, and we understand how that is perpetuated, who the banks lend money to, and on what preferential terms, who sits on boards, who finances and influences political parties that have the means to make deep societal changes, that have the means to make dents in our social infrastructure, beginning with our education system. And when we look at external trade relationships, very little has changed. We still suffer from these unequal power dynamics, third world as opposed to, and of course third world means non-white world, as opposed to first world. And there are internal pressures, ones that we self-perpetuate and we create. Incredibly, Dr. Denny, you would be surprised to learn here in Trinidad and in many countries, it is no longer compulsory to teach history in schools. I really find this mind-blowing. So we are forgetting who we are, not really developing a true sense of identity. Our unique languages, you mentioned indigenous, and I agree with that, but also languages like Creole are trivialized in our educational system and undervalued. And I have been arguing for several years that we are also recolonizing education. There's a lack of true sovereignty and a lack of national pride and patriotism, and very little understanding of what it takes to build nationhood. So we continue to seek validation from outside. And I'm speaking here as a principal at the university, but someone who has been with the University of the West Indies, UE, for most of my career. So for example, just to give you one example, in Trinidad and Tobago until this year or last year, we were giving out 600 scholarships. Government was giving out 600 scholarships. And those children who were performing the best at the Cape could go anywhere in the world to study. So guess where they would go? Not to our own national institutions. I did complain about it. Now we've reduced a bit to 100 instead, but they're still, those are the ones at the top. So they go abroad, they don't wish to come back because they're exposed to all of the technology, everything away. And this is despite the fact that UE is rated among the top 1% universities in the world and #1 in the region. So this is what I mean, we need constant self-validation. And another example, despite being the home of the Usain Bolts and many others, we consistently allow our top universities in the developed world to come to us every year and poach our best potential athletes, send them off to US and wherever, and we lose them to our own development. Yes, there are wins, we know this, but how much better if we could develop our own sporting educational programs and facilities. And many of these persons are indeed Afro-descendants. descendants. And the few artistic inventions we have, the steel pan, the calypso, the reggae, the carnival artistry, the spoken word, they are more or less seen as seasonal extravagances and not as serious artistic contributions that should be mainstreamed in schools and in the public conscience. And I was so intrigued to hear our Afro-Colombian soprano who sang so beautifully. But you know, they took their classical music and they created great schools. You know, you go and you study classical music. Similarly with their art in Europe, the art schools of Paris, which pay homage to these artistic modalities. They are treated as serious disciplines. What have we done with ours? Where does one go to study calypso or steel pan? Yeah. So, and I think also we have to consider some of the inequalities in our education system, which persist. And we saw this, Ambassador Nestor, you mentioned COVID. We saw it in the COVID epidemic so starkly when we were forced to go online. A high percentage of children, even university students, had no access to internet or computers. My own law students, nearly 20% of them didn't have that, believe it or not. And who were those students? Inevitably, race was a factor in poverty and those in rural communities. Primary schools, some had to walk miles to find a parlor or a little shop to borrow a phone or a laptop to access classes. But we are blinded to these realities. At least the system is blinded. We do not even collect the accurate data to measure accurately, but these are important intersectionalities between poverty, race, even gender and origin. And we must strategically and specifically address those in our educational imperatives. Things like expanded access to university. If a child we say all the time that we have equal access to education. I think it's a myth. The child from a comfortable background, as opposed to the child whose parents are poor, and as I said, there's a race factor there too, who has to get up to feed the goats or whose parents can't afford to buy the books or have no money for transport, does not have the same equal opportunity to perform well at what we call the SEA, the first entrance exam, which you're as early as 10 years old and defines you for your whole life. You go to a so-called good school or not, and then on to university. So we have to put things in place to enhance equality, for example, pre-certification requirements, etc. And when we talk about external pressures, still the unequal exploitative trade relationships. And I want to mention in particular, when it comes to research is part of education. So technology, AI, all of these suffer from persistent poverty. So we have research partnerships with universities in first world universities, but often these are predatory relationships, unequal at best, and often you can't access the funding unless you partner with a university from there, but there's very little to gain at the end of it. The funding is structured that way. Our laboratories, our scientific equipment, all of these poorly resourced, undermines our capacity to be innovative, to engender pride, and to be powerful role models, and a huge threat still of poaching, whether it is the cannabis industry, where our valuable seeds and so on, we come to look at it and then they take the seeds, medical pharmaceuticals from traditional knowledge from our forest plants, which is an age-old problem. And we need to send these samples to labs overseas. Sometimes the DNA is poached, artificial ones made. I just saw a documentary this week about that. All of this is education and research, and we must consider our vulnerable position born out of slavery and colonialism, which still persists. I wouldn't even mention the lack of IP protections and awareness. And I want to just add couple last points. Climate change, the added pressures and vulnerabilities that we are always having to play catch up for bare survival, not enough time or resources to move forward, to transcend, to soar, and we don't have equitable international structures to place liabilities where they should be. So the largest polluters, we know who they are, but we get the most impacts. And we don't have a private sector, a commercial sector equipped to fund and to support our research and educational innovations, no matter how fantastic. In my university, I have a whole handful of them, brilliant innovations plastic sealants and so on, but it is so difficult to get an investor or funding. So there's no culture toward funding research and education for future investment. It's viewed as handouts. And that is what developed countries do. They partner with universities to fund research into cancer and so on, and they prioritize their development and social needs. So we did brilliantly in COVID. Our universities, we were there doing the DNA testing and the virological expertise. Now we want to build a genome sequencing lab. There's no ready pool of funding for that investment. We know, we've been told that the historians have shown us the links between our health issues like diabetes and asthma, and lupus and NCDs, which are thought to be byproducts of slavery, poor nutrition, poor environmental conditions, and so on. We should be leading the research and the educational programs, medical programs in our curricula, but again, under-resourced, underfunded, under-targeted. And finally, I want to say there's a role here for reparations. When we start thinking about reparations, we should be thinking strategically. We should be thinking of funding our research and our education, not giving families a handout, but building a structure and a strategy to develop our education research sectors for what I think would be meaningful development and self-sustainability. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Professor Antoine. We will move directly into the presentation of Dr. John Hurl and Anton Sanchez. I pass the floor to you, Dr. Sanchez.
Muy buenas tardes, doctor Néstor Méndez. Gracias por su cordial invitación. Les habla John Antón Sánchez. Soy profesor del Instituto de Altos Estudios Nacionales IAEN, la Universidad de Posgrado del Estado Ecuatoriano. También estoy en el vicerrectorado, soy el vicerrector de la Universidad Intercultural de las Nacionalidades y Pueblos Indígenas del Ecuador, Amaute y Huasi. Y desde esta posición voy a compartir con ustedes unas breves experiencias sobre el tema que se me ha convocado, que tiene que ver con procesos de descolonización y educación superior. Voy a permitir presentar rápidamente unas diapositivas donde compartiré con ustedes unas reflexiones. Como soy un investigador que utiliza siempre los datos cuantitativos, datos empíricos para sustentar mis planteamientos, quiero presentar en primer lugar esta pequeña estadística sobre el sistema de educación superior en el Ecuador. En este país que queda en Sudamérica, que su capital es la ciudad de Quito, vecino con Perú y Colombia, tenemos 261 universidades públicas, 261 instituciones de educación superior, de las cuales públicas hay 107 y privadas 138 y privadas que reciben recursos del Estado 16. El dato más importante que quiero presentar en esta lámina es que hay 29 universidades públicas, de las cuales solo una es una universidad intercultural, que es la cual donde yo ejerzo el vicerrectorado académico. Uno de los problemas que tenemos en la educación superior en el Ecuador es el acceso a la universidad de los pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes. Acceso tanto estudiantes como docentes. En esta lámina podemos ver el ingreso de la educación superior por parte de estudiantes afroecuatorianos, indígenas, aquellos que se autoidentifican como mestizos y blancos, y otro grupo cultural reconocido constitucionalmente que se llama montubios. Lo que me interesa mostrar aquí es cómo la población afrodescendiente e indígena desde el 2019 hasta el 2021 es la que menos acceso a la educación superior posee. Esto en comparación con el número de jóvenes que están en edad de entrar a la universidad. Pueden ver, por ejemplo, de manera muy breve, el caso del pueblo afroecuatoriano. Solo el 3.5% de la población de todos los que ingresan a la universidad, corresponden al pueblo afroecuatoriano. Y solo el 4% que ingresa a la educación superior se identifica como indígena, en correspondencia con el 82.3% de población que está en la universidad que se identifica como mestiza o blanca. Este es un dato muy importante porque hay una desproporción entre población joven que está en edad de entrar a la universidad y población que finalmente entra a la universidad. Otro dato que me interesa poner aquí de presente es cuántos profesores cuántas personas profesionales tienen un puesto como profesor universitario. De acuerdo con datos oficiales del Ministerio de Educación Superior, en el Ecuador existe el 77,7% de docentes que trabajan en las universidades corresponden a población mestiza, y población afroecuatoriana solo es 1,7%, e indígena una cifra absolutamente aterradora, 0,31%. ¿Por qué presento estos datos? Estos datos son claves porque si queremos hablar de descolonización, tenemos que, en primer lugar, desarrollar políticas públicas que fomenten la inclusión de las minorías culturales y raciales al sistema de educación superior, tanto como estudiantes como profesores. Muy bien, ahora una pequeña discusión conceptual sobre procesos de descolonización y educación superior. Solo quiero puntualizar 4 conceptos que, a nuestro modo de ver y por la experiencia que tengo en la Universidad Intercultural de las Nacionalidades y Pueblos Indígenas Amauta-Iwasi, que significa en lengua quichua, que es la segunda lengua que se habla en el Ecuador, significa Casa de la Sabiduría. Recordemos que en Ecuador hay 14 nacionalidades indígenas, y cada nacionalidad habla un idioma diferente. Y hay 18 pueblos dentro de la nacionalidad quichua que son la mayoría demográfica. Y la población indígena corresponde al 7% y la afroecuatoriana al 7% según el censo del 2010. Los conceptos claves. ¿Qué entendemos por descolonización? Y yo quisiera utilizar el concepto del filósofo africano Wa Tiongo, quien tiene una variada literatura sobre teoría de la descolonización. La descolonización implica volver a los orígenes, abandonar los procesos occidentales de imposición cultural, de aculturación. La descolonización pasa por un proceso de renuncia a los cánones, a los valores y conocimientos occidentales europeos y regresar a las raíces. Y el filósofo africano Wa Tiongo, él dice que la recuperación de la lengua es el principal elemento para descolonizar un pensamiento. Pero ¿de dónde saca Wa Tiongo este criterio? Lo toma, diría yo, respetuosamente, de Fran Omar Fanon, quien en su libro Piel Negra, Máscaras Blancas, habla de cómo los idiomas pueden ser factores claves para que el afrodescendiente pueda superar los procesos de blanqueamiento y aculturación. Otro concepto importante es la interculturalidad. Ecuador es un país intercultural y la interculturalidad es un mecanismo de entendimiento entre la diversidad de todas las nacionalidades y pueblos que existimos en este país. Aquí hay una gran presencia de pueblos afrodescendientes, de pueblos indígenas, pueblos montubios y una diversidad cultural de poblaciones mestizas. La interculturalidad es una vía importante para la descolonización. Otro concepto importante es la plurinacionalidad. Es una propuesta muy interesante que viene de los pueblos indígenas de los pueblos originarios para construir un modelo de Estado absolutamente distinto a el modelo de Estado liberal. Desafortunadamente, no tengo mucho tiempo para explicar todos estos conceptos. Otro elemento importante es la soberanía epistémica. La universidad ecuatoriana y latinoamericana debe generar un proceso de soberanía epistémica a partir de los nuevos conceptos que son descolonizantes, conceptos que vienen de las filosofías, de los valores, de los sabios, de los pueblos indígenas, los pueblos afrodescendientes y los pueblos montubios. La soberanía epistémica implica una visión propia del desarrollo, una visión propia de los valores y una visión propia y muy distinta al modelo occidental capitalista. Y un proceso clave es la revitalización lingüística. Aquí, en esta universidad, por ejemplo, creemos que recuperar las lenguas de las nacionalidades y pueblos es un factor importante para la descolonización. En esta universidad, y quiero mostrar aquí unos elementos rapidísimo de cómo estamos orientando la Universidad Intercultural Amauta Iwasi, sobre todo a partir de principios de interculturalidad. Primer principio, reconocimiento de las epistemologías, aquellas epistemologías que no son de Occidente. Segundo principio, la redistribución de la riqueza. Y la profesora de Trinidad y Tobago, la profesora que me antecedió, hablaba de las reparaciones. Las reparaciones son un derecho constitucional que está en el artículo 57 de la Constitución ecuatoriana, donde dice que las víctimas históricas de la discriminación racial deben ser reparadas. Y reparar implica redistribuir la riqueza, implica redistribuir los espacios de poder. Y esta universidad intercultural es un elemento reparador. Y nosotros, por ejemplo, ¿cómo estamos reparando a los pueblos y nacionalidades que han estado por fuera del sistema universitario? Por ejemplo, nuestros planes de estudio. Nuestros planes de estudios, nuestros programas de licenciaturas y de ingeniería que impulsamos en la universidad están orientados con una naturaleza descolonizadora, pluriepistémica, científica, orientándola hacia la construcción del Estado plurinacional, la vitalidad de los idiomas ancestrales, la revitalización del summa causa, que es el buen vivir desde la visión de los pueblos indígenas y la garantía de los derechos colectivos. Por ello, nosotros consideramos absolutamente importante desarrollar un pensum de estudio, un programa curricular que lleve a la descolonización. Finalmente, quiero terminar mi presentación con la propuesta afrodescendiente para descolonizar la educación superior. Esta propuesta se llama la etnoeducación. Pero para entender la etnoeducación es importante superar unos desafíos que tenemos aquí en el Ecuador para descolonizar la educación superior. Primer desafío, interpretación perversa de la interculturalidad. ¿Qué significa esto? Que hay grupos culturales que por algunas circunstancias quieren desarrollar una estrategia de imposición cultural frente a otros grupos y ven una interpretación de la interculturalidad de manera sesgada. Y eso para mí es absolutamente peligroso en una democracia intercultural cuando un grupo quiere abrogarse la interculturalidad para sí. Otro elemento que tenemos que superar es la supremacía étnica de algunos sectores culturales, donde quizás un grupo cultural tiene esa tendencia a sentirse más importantes que otros grupos y niega y rechaza la participación en procesos universitarios interculturales de grupos minoritarios. Y esto, por supuesto, lleva a otro problema, que es el corporativismo cultural y la exclusión. El corporativismo es tomarse las instituciones del Estado para su beneficio propio. Y esto conlleva la cooptación del Estado por colectivos esencialistas. Esto es elementos muy claves que tenemos que tener en cuenta para superar la colonización en la educación superior. Y finalmente, ¿qué es la etnoeducación? La etnoeducación y voy a leerlo para ser precisos y terminar con el tiempo. Es una propuesta afrodescendiente para descolonizar la sociedad ecuatoriana y construir la interculturalidad. Implica una liberación y la libertad cultural de los pueblos y sujetos colonizados. Implica ser un instrumento para la construcción de la herramienta necesaria del Estado plurinacional. La etnoeducación es un mecanismo para el fortalecimiento de la identidad cultural de los pueblos de la diáspora africana en las Américas, y la etnoeducación es una propuesta eficaz para la garantía de los derechos como pueblos y como sujetos ciudadanos de derechos colectivos. Esto es, estimados compañeros, gracias audiencia de la OEA, que tenemos preparados para ustedes en el tema de cómo descolonizar la educación superior y crear una sociedad intercultural. ¿Sí? Con la bendición de los ancestros, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanchez. It is my simple duty, after all of the hard work has been done by our panelists, to express thanks on behalf of Assistant Secretary General Mendez. Our panelists so valued the moment and the space to share with you and with us that they afforded us time and insights sufficient to plant seeds on which we can continue to contemplate the way forward. We heard about the Garifuna site of memory and final rest in Balitho, and how this serves to build knowledge and to honor rather than to pervert the truth. We heard also about the flight of talent from many of the sub-regions that in which we have significant populations of people of African descent, the brain drain, the abundance of innovation, creativity, and juxtaposed with the scarcity of resources. And we also heard important concepts shared for advancing our thoughts. We heard about decolonization, interculturality, plural nationality, and linguistic revitalization. To you, Dr. Antoine, Dr. John Herlin Anton Sanchez, Dr. Gary Denny, I transmit words of sincere appreciation for your work in the field of education and for your participation in today's meaningful conversation on the subject of inspiring pride in Afro-descendants as part of educational policy in action. To the hardworking teams that collaborated to ensure today's success, we acknowledge that each of you contributed to this polished, remarkable outcome that met our stated objectives. The staff of the Executive Office of the Assistant Secretary General, with special thanks to Abayomi Edwards Dyer, who was part of the comprehensive planning and implementation, and she dealt in the minutiae in getting to today's event. To the team from the Department of Conferences and Meetings Management, our efficient interpreters, the OAS national offices across the hemisphere, to every colleague who simply encouraged and applauded us as we worked during the Inter-American Week for peoples of African descent in the Americas, thank you very much. Of course, we would never have considered today worthwhile if we were only speaking among ourselves. Dear virtual audience, we acknowledge your major contribution to today's outcome simply by your presence. And we invite you to continue to be a part of the regular conversations through future editions of A Chat with the OS. Thank you for your interest in the subject of transformative education in the Americas, for your time shared with us today, and for your active investment in our hemisphere. To one and all, I extend my very best wishes for a memorable weekend, and I close by reiterating deepest thanks for your presence and for your participation. Good afternoon to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Me despido. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm going to close the meeting.